Winter in Dusty Creek, a young woman is traded like cattle by her own uncle. 18-year-old June Avery finds herself in the house of Ethan Hale, a widower raising three wary children. The rooms are neat, but the air is cold. June burns biscuits, stumbles at chores, yet keeps learning by lamplight. Then fever grips the littlest girl, and June stays up 3 nights until the child whispers one trembling word, Mama. But whispers spread too, that June is only a bargain, not a bride. When a careless remark cuts her to the bone, she runs into the snow. Will Ethan find the courage to speak his true heart before it's too late? Snow swept across Dusty Creek in hard, slanting lines, stinging the skin of anyone still out in it. At the far end of Main Street, lamplight spilled from the saloon's windows and the courthouse beside it. Inside that light, a deal was being made, one that would rattle the quiet balance of the Silver Spur Ranch. Clive Avery, red-faced from whiskey and wind, leaned across a table toward Ethan Hale. A man alone can't run a place like yours. You need more than hands. You need a woman to keep the fire and mind the children. His smile was too wide, teeth yellowed. Lucky for you, I've got one in the family. June, 18. Strong enough and not one to sass. You take her, I'll take 500 cash and that brindle bull you prize. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. His hat rested on his knee, hands steady on the brim. He'd buried a wife 2 winters past, and had since learned silence could carry farther than words. Finally, he spoke low. You're talking about your niece like she's a wagon to be traded, Clive snorted. Better she be kept by a decent widower than starve under my roof. You know how tongues wag. Folks already whisper she eats more than she earns. Think of it as saving face all around. Ethan looked past Clive toward the frosted window. The image of his children flickered there. Ben at 11, trying too hard to fill, boots too big, Ruthie, quiet and watchful at 9, little Millie, still asking at bedtime when Mama was coming back. Their house was clean but hollow, like a church with no hymn. He exhaled once. She deserves a choice. Clive shoved a folded paper across the table. Her choice is to freeze or to be housed. You sign, you get her, else I find another taker. Ethan didn't sign that night, but before dawn, with snow drifting high along the corral, Clive's wagon rattled up the Silver Spur lane. June sat on the seat beside him, a small bundle clutched to her chest, eyes wide and guarded. Here she is, Clive announced, swinging down. He slapped the bull's flank, where the brand steamed in the cold. Fair trade. Hale, she's yours now. Papers say so. Ethan stood on the porch, coat buttoned, boots planted solid. He met June's eyes, saw fear there, and also a stubborn line in her jaw. He glanced at his children peeking from the doorway, uncertain. Then he nodded once. Come inside. It's warmer. There June stepped down, nearly slipping on ice. Her hands were raw from cold, her coat too thin. Inside the ranch house, the stove glowed, but the air felt brittle. Ruthie stood stiff, Ben crossed his arms, and Millie hid behind her brother's leg. June set her bundle on a chair. It held 2 dresses, a comb, and a tattered hymn book. Supper was awkward. June burned the biscuits, and Ruthie wrinkled her nose. Ben whispered that she didn't know how to draw water from the pump. Ethan said nothing, only left a note by the stove before heading to the barn. Oak burns steady, use it first. The next morning, another note appeared. Parboil potatoes before frying, saves waste. Later still, Millie likes a pinch of cinnamon in porridge. June read each line twice, cheeks warm. No praise, no blame, just guidance, quiet as footsteps on snow. But outside the ranch, tongues wagged. At the mercantile, a woman muttered loud enough for June to hear. Bought like stock. Shameful. At church, Clive strutted, boasting of his clever deal. Men smirked, women whispered. The storm over the hills deepened, and even in town folks said trouble was riding with it. June kept her head low, but in the privacy of the lamplight she traced Ethan's notes with her fingertip, wondering if silence could carry more mercy than words. Still, Clive's grin lingered like smoke. What price will he demand next, now that he thinks his bargain holds power over them all? Snow lingered in the furrows of Silver Spur's yard, crusted with ice that crunched under boots. Life inside the house carried on awkwardly. June rose before dawn, fumbling with the pump, splashing herself more than the bucket. She set porridge on the fire only to scorch the bottom. Ben rolled his eyes. Ruthie folded her arms. Millie asked when Mama was coming home, words that sliced sharper than cold wind. Ethan never raised his voice. Instead, he left another note on the table. Stir slow, scrape the pot's edge as you go. June read it twice, cheeks burning. At least he noticed. By week's end, whispers carried from town. At the Mercantile, June overheard two women muttering about bought wives and girls traded like cattle. She pressed her basket tighter, heart thudding. When she returned, she found Ethan mending tack in the barn. "They're saying things," she murmured. His hands stilled. "Folks always will," he said. "What matters is what we do here." He didn't meet her eyes, but his words steadied her all the same. Trouble rode closer than gossip. Clive Avery returned, boots crunching across the frozen yard, his grin smug. "Fine bull," he said, patting his gloves. "But papers don't mean much unless they're clean." "Might be." "I find a flaw unless you sweeten the deal, Ethan." "A few more dollars, maybe a cow or two." Ethan stood in the doorway, broad frame shadowing the light. "You've had your bargain," Clive smirked. "Think on it. Be a shame if word got out the trade's not binding." He tipped his hat toward June and left dust and threat behind him. That night, the house grew heavy with unease. June sat by the stove, stitching Millie's doll dress with clumsy fingers. Ethan polished his ledger in silence, the scrape of his pen sharp. Ben stacked wood, but dropped more than he carried. Ruthie sat by the window, watching for riders. Then Millie's small voice broke the hush. "I don't feel good, Mama." Her forehead burned. By midnight, sweat soaked her hair. June fetched willow bark, crushed it into bitter tea, and coaxed it past the child's lips. She bathed her face, sang lullabies she barely remembered, and prayed. Through it all, Ethan sat outside the door, boots on the step, hat in his hands, silent sentinel. 3 nights passed before the fever broke. Millie stirred, weak but smiling, and whispered one trembling word. "Mama?" June froze, tears spilling before she could stop them. She looked toward the door. Ethan's shadow shifted, his eyes glinting with something unspoken. He didn't come in. He only lowered his head, as though humbled by what he had heard. At dawn, Ruthie and Ben clung to June's skirts. The house smelled of broth and wood smoke. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the eaves. Ethan lingered in the barn longer than usual, hammering nails that didn't need hammering. When he returned, his ledger lay open, new entries written in his plain, careful hand, recording not cattle, but each cost tied to Clive's name. Quiet preparation, steady as winter thaw, yet word spread fast. Clive bragged in town that he could still call June back. Laughter followed him down Main Street. People began to watch Ethan's family with eyes sharpened by gossip. Back at the ranch, June brushed Millie's hair and set bread to rise, her hands steadier than before. She was learning the rhythm of the place. Still, the question hung in every silence. Would Clive's threats hold, or would Ethan's quiet resolve prove stronger? Sometimes a single word, like "Mama," can change the weight of an entire house. If you were in Ethan's boots, would you stand quiet or speak out loud? Tell us in the comments, share this story with a friend, and subscribe for the next chapter of Dusty Creek. Snow still crusted the fence posts when Ethan hitched his wagon for town. He carried no cattle today, only a folded newspaper and the quiet weight of worry. June rode beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. She had wanted to stay with the children, but Ethan had asked plain, "Come with me. It concerns you too." At the Mercantile, Doc Finch waved them over with his weathered hand. The old prospector leaned on the counter, spectacles perched crooked. "Saw this posted down at the courthouse," he said, sliding a circular across. "Any bargain mixing livestock with human chattel is void. Says right here, tainted consideration, they call it. If a bull changes hands in the same breath as a woman, the whole thing falls to pieces." Ethan read the lines twice, lips pressed tight. His thumb brushed the edge where ink bled through. Cheap paper. "So, Clive bragging might wreck his own claim," he murmured. "Exactly," Doc said. "He's shouting himself into a corner." June's eyes flicked from one man to the other. "Then I'm not bound to him?" Ethan folded the circular carefully. "You were never bound to him. But now there's law that proves it." He touched the brim of his hat in thanks and led June back to the wagon. On the ride home, the silence pressed thick. June wanted to ask what he intended, whether he would tear the bargain outright, but she feared the answer, feared that her place in the Hale household hung on convenience alone. That evening, she found something small waiting at her chair, a belt Ethan had stitched where the leather split. The mending was plain but careful, thread pulled tight, buckle polished. She ran her fingers over it, smiling despite herself. Later, voices drifted from the porch. June paused in the kitchen doorway, her heart leaping at Ethan's low drawl. Two ranch hands laughed rough, needling him about his bought bride. Ethan's reply came quick, sharp-edged. "It's convenience, nothing more." The words cut. She pressed a hand to her chest, breath shallow. Maybe he had meant to shield her from their filth, but he had spoken them plain. She slipped into the quiet of the cabin, gathered the stitched belt and a sheet of paper, and wrote only a few lines. "I will not be a burden. Thank you for shelter." By the time moonlight washed across the yard, the letter lay folded neat on the table. The belt rested atop it. June pulled on her thin cloak and stepped into the snow. Ruthie, restless from dreams, stirred and padded into the kitchen. She found the empty chair, the folded paper, and the belt glinting in lamplight. Her small voice trembled. "Papa?" Ethan came in from the barn, brushing straw from his coat. He saw the letter, saw Ruthie's pale face, and felt the room tilt. He lifted the belt with fingers that had mended it, then opened the paper. His throat tightened as he read. Ben came down the loft ladder, alarm in his eyes. Millie whimpered in her sleep. Ethan folded the letter, jaw set. Outside, fresh snow pointed a trail toward the creek bed. He pulled on his coat, saddled his horse without a word. The children stood on the porch, clutching one another, brave and small. Ruthie called after him, "Bring her back, Papa!" The wind cut sharp, carrying the scent of river ice. In the distance, a shape moved along the frozen bend, small, determined, fading into stormlight. Ethan spurred forward, the stitched belt clenched in his pocket, his heart pounding harder than the hooves beneath him. Would he find the words in time, or had silence already driven June too far into the snow? Sunday dawned sharp and cold, the church bell clanging through clear air. Dusty Creek gathered in its best coats and shawls, eager for food and talk as much as hymns. Ethan brought his children, their boots polished though worn. Ruthie carried Millie's hand. Ben walked ahead with stiff pride. But one face was missing, June's. She had slipped away in the night, her letter and the mended belt still heavy in Ethan's pocket. The service blurred, Ethan's voice caught on the hymns, his mind half on the pew, half on the snowy trail he'd glimpsed. Afterward, the congregation spilled into the yard where tables groaned under pies and beans. Gossip rose like smoke. "Poor girl," one woman whispered. "Bought like a mule. She's been kind to the children," another countered. "You can't deny that." Clive Avery chose that moment to stride forward, boots gleaming, hat cocked. He pulled a folded sheet from his coat and held it high. "Bill of sale," he crowed. "Signed and witnessed. My niece was never his to keep. I can call her back whenever I choose." Murmurs rippled, some shocked, some eager for spectacle. Ethan stepped forward, calm as stone. "You call it a sale. I call it void. Paper don't stand when it mixes people with stock. Sheriff ought to see those brand papers clean." The sheriff, gray-bearded and weary of both men, scratched his jaw. "I'll look," he said evenly. "Law has its ways." He took the papers, but gave no sign whose side he leaned. Through it all, Ethan's eyes searched the crowd, finding no trace of June. The children clung close, sensing the weight in the air. Ruthie whispered, "Papa, where's she gone?" He couldn't answer. At dusk, after the last pie plate was scraped, Ethan returned home. The house felt hollow. On the table, her letter lay where he'd left it, words plain as ache. The belt sat folded neat, his stitches mocking him. He slipped both into his coat and stepped outside. Snow glimmered silver under the rising moon. Tracks cut clean toward the creek bed. Small boots pressed into drifts. He saddled his horse without a word. The children stood on the porch, faces pale in lamplight. "We'll be all right," Ben said bravely, though his voice trembled. Ethan touched his son's shoulder. "Stay close to the fire. I'll bring her back." Mounted and turned toward the frozen bend. Wind scoured his face, the night alive with the hiss of snow across ice. He pressed the horse hard, following the trail as it wound along the bank. Then he saw it, a figure huddled near the creek, cloak drawn tight, head bowed against the cold. "June!" His voice cracked through the stillness. She flinched, tried to rise, but her knees buckled. Ethan swung down, dropping the reins, and knelt in the snow. Her eyes shone with tears and frost. "You said it was convenience," she whispered. "That's all I am." Ethan's chest ached. He drew the belt from his pocket, holding it between them. "I said those words to shield you from filth, not to shame you. My heart was too coward to speak plain. I've feared love since burying my wife. But you're not convenience, June. You're choice. My choice. The wind whipped his words away, but she heard them. She trembled, torn between anger and fragile hope. All I ever wanted was to matter, she said. You do, he answered simply. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, lifted her gently to her feet. Come home. Behind them, the creek groaned under ice, a sound like the land itself listening. Ethan led her toward the waiting horse, his hand steady at her back. But Clive's threat still hung over the town, and the sheriff's ledger was yet to be written. Would Ethan's bold ride into town at dawn secure June's freedom, or drag him into chains of his own? The night ride from the creek left Ethan hollow, but resolved. June sat before the fire, her cloak steaming, hands wrapped in a mug of broth. He had spoken more truth in the snow than he had in years, and now there was no turning back. By first light, he was saddled again, ledger tucked under his arm, the mended belt in his pocket, and June watching from the doorway with the children close at her skirts. I'll set it proper, he told her. No shadow hanging over you. Or over us, she only nodded, though fear lingered in her eyes. Ethan rode straight into town and dismounted at the sheriff's office. Inside, he placed the brindle bull's rope on the desk. Neutral corral, he said. Hold him there until the court sees fit. He's no longer part of my household or my bargain. The sheriff raised his brows. That's bold, Hale. Clive won't take kindly. Law don't bend to kindness or temper. File this affidavit. He laid down the paper he had spent half the night drafting, citing Doc Finch's circular and every witness to Clive's boasts. The trade was void. June Avery stays by her will alone. Before the sheriff could answer, the door slammed wide. Clive stormed in, face red as fresh brand. Abduction, he roared. He stole my niece. Papers say she's mine, and he's parading her like a prize. The sheriff stood, palms raised. You'll both have your day, but I'll not see blood spilled over this. Clive jabbed a finger toward Ethan. I'll see you in chains before sundown. Ethan met his eyes calmly. If that's what it takes to show truth, so, be it by noon, word spread faster than fire on dry grass. Folks whispered along Main Street. Ethan Hale had turned the bull over, filed papers, and dared the law to decide. Some called him foolhardy, others brave. June heard the talk herself when she went for flour, Ruthie clinging to her hand. Women stared. One murmured, she must be worth it. June's cheeks burned, but her chin lifted higher. Back at the ranch, Ethan returned in the afternoon, weary but steady. The children ran to him, relief plain. June met him at the porch. You risked everything. I risked nothing worth keeping if it meant losing you, he answered quietly. That night, as snow fell soft and slow, the family ate stew in silence. Yet beneath the stillness there was a new warmth, something tentative but real. June looked at Ethan across the table and felt her heart ache with both gratitude and fear. Gratitude for his courage, fear for the storm Clive would surely bring. Her fear proved right. Just before dawn, heavy, knocks rattled the door. The sheriff himself stood there, hat in hand, deputy close behind. Ethan Hale, he said with regret. By complaint filed, I'm bound to arrest you for unlawful seizure of person. June gasped, but Ethan only touched her shoulder gently. Tend the children. Keep the fire. He kissed Millie's hair, clasped Ben's hand, and met Ruthie's tearful eyes. Then he let them place irons on his wrists, calm, dignified, unwilling to turn this into spectacle. As he was led away, June stepped onto the porch, snowflakes settling in her hair. We'll stand with you, she called after him. Her voice carried farther than she knew, straight into the ears of neighbors stirring awake across the valley. The sheriff's lantern bobbed as they vanished into the dark, leaving June and the children alone at the threshold. The fire behind her crackled, but the cold ahead felt merciless. She clutched Ethan's ledger to her chest, the stitched belt folded inside. Could one night in a cell undo all that mercy had built, or would it prove the very strength that bound them together? The cell in Dusty Creek was little more than stone walls and a cot, but Ethan carried himself as if it were another room of his ranch. He tipped his hat to Deputy Lawson when the door clanged shut. I'll be no trouble, he said, then settled on the bench, hands folded. Word spread quick. By sundown, half the town knew Ethan Hale sat behind bars on Clive Avery's complaint. Some shook their heads at his folly. Others, remembering June's care for the children and Ethan's steady ways, felt unease gnawing. At the ranch, June kept her shoulders straight. She kneaded dough, stoked the fire, and tucked Millie in, though her hands shook when no one watched. Ruthie asked if Papa was coming back tomorrow. June answered with a voice she prayed sounded certain. Yes, love. Tomorrow, when the house was quiet, she wrapped a loaf in cloth and walked into town with Ben at her side. The night was raw, wind sharp, against her face. At the jail, the deputy hesitated but finally let her through. Ethan sat calm, hat on his knee. I brought you bread, June said softly, slipping the bundle through the bars. The children helped. Ethan's eyes met hers, steady and warm. You kept them safe. That's all that matters, her throat tightened. They're scared. So am I. He leaned closer, voice low. Fear's no shame, but we don't run from it. Tomorrow the judge hears both sides. Truth will stand. Doc Finch shuffled in behind her, cane tapping the floor. You're not alone, Hale. I've signed a statement, heard Clive boasting more than once about his clever trade. The schoolmarm, too. She's put ink to paper. And those ranch hands who saw him brag at the saloon? They'll testify. Ethan nodded his thanks. June reached through the bars, brushing his hand. For a moment, the weight of the stone walls felt lighter. The night dragged. June returned home with Ben, finding Ruthie asleep by the fire, and Millie curled with her doll. She sat at the table, staring at Ethan's ledger. Each line of careful script told of a man who measured his life by honesty, not gain. She pressed her palm against the page and whispered, We're not leaving. Morning dawned gray, snowmelt running in the ruts of Main Street. The jail bell tolled softly, calling folks to watch. The town divided clean, half curious, half waiting to see which way the wind would blow. In the cell, Ethan washed his face in a tin basin, smoothed his hair, and straightened his coat. To the deputy, he said simply, Let's settle it proper. At the ranch, June dressed the children in their best. Ruthie tied Millie's bonnet with careful hands. Ben tried to stand taller, like his father. Before stepping out, June looked around the cabin, the neat stove, the belt Ethan had mended still lying folded on the shelf. She took it, slipped it into her pocket, and whispered a prayer. On the boardwalk, Clive Avery polished his boots and grinned wide for all to see. Today the judge will give me back what's mine, he boasted, but his voice rang false, his swagger edged with desperation. Inside, Ethan clasped his hands, eyes clear. June entered with the children, her steps measured, her chin high. She took a seat close to the bars, as if to say without words that she would not be moved. The hearing was set for noon. The sheriff gathered papers. The judge adjusted his spectacles. Neighbors filled the room, their whispers hushed as the gavel struck. Ethan lifted his head, calm as a man who knew storms came and went, but truth endured. Would the law see it that way, or would Clive's lies twist the scales before the whole town? The schoolhouse was packed tighter than a branding pen, air heavy with breath and tension. Ben clutched June's hand. Ruthie sat stiff beside her, and Millie leaned against her shoulder with wide, watchful eyes. At the front, the judge cleared his throat, spectacles low on his nose. Ethan stood tall despite the iron chain at True, his wrist, hat in hand, voice steady. Across from him, Clive Avery strutted like a rooster, waving his folded paper for all to see. This here's a bill of sale, Clive boomed. Signed, sealed, witnessed. That girl belongs to me. Hale's been keeping her under false pretense. Murmurs rippled, some shocked, some eager for scandal. Ethan waited for quiet, then spoke. Judge, I kept a ledger. Dates, sums, every word Clive bragged to men in town. That bargain was never clean. It mixed a bull with a woman's life. Law calls that void. He placed the small book on the table, its pages filled with careful script. The sheriff stepped forward with calm authority. The brindle bull sits in neutral corral. Brand transfer incomplete. Papers unfinished. No man can claim both animal and kin in one bargain. He handed the judge the paperwork, each line stark against the morning light. Clive sneered. You'd trust ink from a cowhand over a signed bill? But Doc Finch limped forward, cane tapping the floor. Not cowhand's ink, mine. I heard you, Clive. Bragged in the mercantile, laughed about selling June like stock. I swore it before God and law. The schoolmarm added her voice, cheeks flushed with courage. And I signed too. The children in this town deserve truth, not to grow under the shadow of lies. Clive faltered, but pressed on, waving his paper. All of it means nothing. I have contract in hand. Ethan turned, his gaze steady on the bench. Let June speak. She's the only one who can tell where she belongs. The room fell silent. June rose, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, but her voice rang clear. I was never Clive's to trade. I choose this ranch. I choose these children. I choose Ethan Hale. Her words echoed against wood and stone, stronger than any ink on paper. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing as he weighed it all. At last, he struck the table with his gavel. The so-called sale is null, the contract tainted. Ethan Hale is released, and June Avery stands, free by her own will. Consent or nothing. That is the law, gasps, then cheers, swept through the schoolhouse. Ben gripped June's hand tighter, Ruthie's stiff shoulders loosened, and Millie whispered, Mama, with quiet certainty. Ethan drew a long breath, shoulders easing as though a yoke had been lifted. Clive sputtered, face red, but the sheriff laid a hand on his arm. That's enough. Papers and pride don't outweigh truth. The crowd spilled out into the yard, buzzing with talk. Some looked ashamed for ever believing Clive. Others clapped Ethan's back. But through the noise, thunder rolled faint across the ridge, a storm building fast. Ethan glanced skyward, knowing their hardest trials might not yet be behind them. June slipped to his side, her fingers brushing his. It's settled now? She asked softly. For the law, yes, Ethan said. For us, it's only just begun. The children gathered close, sensing both relief and the rumble of what lay ahead. Above the church steeple, clouds thickened, heavy with rain. Would this family's hard-won freedom survive the storm that was already breaking over the flats? The spring storm came sudden, black clouds tearing across the flats like wild horses. By afternoon, wind howled through Silver Spur's fence lines and rain slashed in sheets. Ethan hurried the herd toward shelter, hat brim dripping, boots sinking in mud. June pulled Ruthie and Millie inside, shutters banging as she barred them tight. Ben, stubborn and eager to prove himself, tried to help his father drive a skittish bay toward the barn. The thunder cracked sharp. The bay bolted. Ben was thrown hard, landing in the muck with a cry that turned June cold. Ethan reached him first, lifting his boy in trembling arms. Ben's face was pale, breath ragged. Get Doc Finch, Ethan shouted, voice hoarse over the storm. June ran into the rain, skirts heavy, fear clawing her throat. By the time she returned with the old prospector doctor, Ben burned with fever, leg bruised and ribs aching. The storm raged through the night while the household gathered close, June dabbing Ben's brow, whispering prayers. Ethan paced like a man fighting shadows. On the second night, June found him at the window, shoulders tight. You blame yourself, she said softly. His voice broke. I let him ride close, wanted him to feel useful. And now, she touched his arm. You gave him trust. That is not blame, but still Ethan carried the weight. Each hour that Ben coughed, his guilt deepened. Ruthie sat beside her brother, eyes rimmed red. Millie clutched her doll, too scared to sleep. June read scripture in a steady voice, letting the words weave calm into the children's hearts, even when her own heart quaked. By the fourth night, exhaustion pressed heavy. June held Ben's hand, her tears slipping at last. Please, child, she whispered. Please stay. Ben stirred, eyes fluttering open. His voice was thin as smoke. Mama, you cry for me? June's breath caught. She kissed his forehead, sobbing softly. Yes, my sweet boy. I cry because I love you. Ethan stood in the doorway, shoulders shaking with relief. He crossed the room and sat beside them, taking his son's other hand. You'll heal, Ben. We'll see to it. When dawn broke clear, the storm had passed. Ben's fever eased, color returning slow but sure. The family gathered in the meadow when the sun lifted, wet grass glittering with raindrops. It was there Ethan finally found the words he had been holding. He turned to June, voice thick but certain. I nearly lost more than my son this week. I nearly lost the courage to live again. You gave us back more than care. You gave us back hope. I don't want this house to be built on bargains. I want it built on vows neighbors gathered days later, small but true. Doc Finch, the schoolmarm, the sheriff, and a baker's dozen ranch hands who had stood by them. Under wildflowers, Ethan and June spoke simple words. Abel Rusk, gruff blacksmith, hammered 2 plain rings from shoe, nails. They slid them on each other's hands, rough metal gleaming like silver. As the vows settled in the air, Clive Avery appeared at the edge of the crowd. His hat hung low, his steps heavy, pride cracked in his face. He He cleared his throat. I was wrong. I treated kin like stock. It shames me. I've no right to ask, but will you forgive me? Silence held. June met his eyes. Not for your sake, Clive, for mine. I forgive so I can walk forward light. The crowd breathed out, shoulders easing. Ethan placed his hand over June's, the stitched belt tied now with new meaning. A storm had nearly torn them apart, but mercy had bound them stronger. Would that mercy be enough to carry them into the long years ahead, when the final test of love and belonging still waited? Spring returned gentle, the land softened by rain, and Silver Spur breathed as though released from a long-held ache. Grass rose bright, cattle grazed steady, and children's laughter carried from the schoolhouse porch. For the first time in years, Ethan Hale let himself believe the ranch was more than survival. It was home. He walked with June to the cottonwood at the meadow's edge, the one that shaded his first wife's resting place. He paused, hat in hand. I want to honor what was, he said softly, and plant something new beside it. June touched his arm, eyes wet but steady. Then let's do it together. They knelt in the damp soil, setting a young sapling near the old roots. Ben pressed earth around it, Ruthie carried water, and little Millie patted the mound with her small hands. Ethan unfastened a simple necklace that had belonged to his mother and placed it in June's palm. This is yours now. I want them to call you Mama, not by bargain, but by the love that holds us. June's tears slipped, but her smile shone brighter. Then Mama I will be. Neighbors came to see the tree, leaving quiet gifts, seed potatoes, a quilt patch, a tin of sugar. Doc Finch raised a hand in benediction. Mercy built this fence, stronger than pride ever could. The sheriff nodded, his voice rough. And law finally caught up with decency. As dusk fell, the family lingered in the meadow. Ruthie chased Millie through the grass, Ben sketched cattle brands on a slate, and June stood barefoot, one hand pressed gently against her belly. Ethan watched her, a new light dawning in his eyes. The promise of another life had begun, as soft and steady as the rain-fed stream. He drew her close. The road ahead will be long, but we'll walk it together. June rested her head against his shoulder. And when storms come again, we'll remember this day. The cottonwood rustled in the evening breeze, leaves catching the last gold light. Dusty Creek had learned a lesson it would not forget, that mercy outlasts swagger, that choice carries more weight than any paper, and that families, whether by blood or by bond, are built on the courage to begin again. And maybe that's the story worth carrying, how a widower, a girl once traded, and 3 children chose one another and turned a bargain into a home. If you were standing in that meadow, would you believe mercy can outlast pride? Tell us in the comments, share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to hear the next tale from Dusty Creek.